Hey guys, this is Michael from French class NYC, and today I'm going to present a workshop on indirect object pronouns in French, les pronoms compléments d'objet indirect. So the workshop will be organized as follow. So I'm going to start with an introduction. It's going to be a general introduction, extremely important for you to understand how French people construct, build sentences in French. And then I'm going to review what I mean by indirect object versus direct objects, because I think it's important to know what is what so that we can move on. Then I'm going to talk about the indirect object pronouns. And to conclude, I'm going to talk about the order of the pronouns because French people love to use pronouns. And sometimes we can have two or three pronouns in the same sentence, and there is an order to follow. So I'm going to talk about this at the very end of the workshop. Okay, so to start with this workshop, I want to focus on two French concepts. One is called la phrase nominale. And la phrase nominale, which means the sentence with a noun. We call phrase nominale any sentence that doesn't have any conjugated verb in it, versus phrase verbale. Phrase verbale, as you can see, verbal, you can understand that it is a sentence that has a conjugated verb into it. For all my students, I think this is extremely important to be aware of these two distinctions. So, phrase nominale, as I said, is a sentence that has no conjugated verb into it. For instance, in French, when you say something like la jolie maison, you have a bunch of words together. That's a sentence, but there's no verb into it. Or when you say something like that, oui, Michael, that's a sentence, but there's no verb into it. On the other hand, we have what we call la phrase verbale. La phrase verbale, sentence that have conjugated verb in it. For instance, je mange une pomme, and je mange une pomme, there's a verb, a conjugated verb, which is mange. And my sentence, ma phrase verbale, in French, is built around the verb mange. Another example, je parle à mes parents. That's another phrase verbale in French, a sentence built around the verb parle, which means to speak. And the last example I wanted to give you is je vais à Paris. Je vais à Paris. That's another example of phrase verbale. So I think it is extremely important to know the difference between the two. And phrase verbale, it's what you use mostly, I would say, in French when you speak in class or when you do your homework. Phrase verbale because you use conjugated verb. So in the next slide, I'm going to dissect what you should do when you do homework related to pronouns and so on. And I'm going to use these three examples that I used in the beginning so that I will tell you precisely how French kids, how French people in general build, construct sentences in French. So let's start with the first example with a direct object. Je mange une pomme. I eat an apple. So, a French kid, a French person doing grammar, doing the first thing you need to find out is the verb. We have phrase verbale, and the key things, the first element you're going to look for is the conjugated verb. So, verb, mange. And you know, in French, when we use conjugated verb, we need a subject. Unless you're using imperative, or usually, I would say in 99% of the cases, you have a subject, what that we call sujet. Or, je is the subject, mange is the verb. And if I were lazy, I could just make a sentence like that. Je mange. That would be une phrase verbale, a grammatically correct sentence. Je mange. But that's not enough because I'm curious. I want to know what you are eating. And this is why you're going to use maybe a direct object, like une pomme. Je mange une pomme. I noticed that many of my students struggle with direct object versus location and all of that. Why is it a direct object? So, in the next slide, I will explain again how to um, identify a direct object in a sentence in French. You need to ask yourself the question you would ask to have the missing information. Let's say that I'm talking and there's a lot of noise around me, and you hear je mange. The question you would ask to get the missing information will be a what type of question. That's an open ended question, and you would ask qu'est-ce que tu manges, or tu manges quoi, or que manges-tu? But in any case, I'm asking a what type of questions. So, to find the direct object in French, you need to ask yourself what or whom, for instance. Let's say I'm saying I'm eating my wife, je mange ma femme. Uh, that will be the same process. Je mange qui? I'm eating whom. Okay? Complément d'objet direct, direct object. But for today, I want you to talk about indirect object. So this is another example of phrase verbale with an indirect object. This is the most important part of the presentation of today. So, first thing first, before you rush to find the indirect object, go back to the basic. First thing first, phrase verbale, my first things to do is to find the verb. Parle. D'accord? My verb is related to a subject, which is je parle. But I'm adding information to my statement, and I'm saying to whom I'm speaking. And I'm speaking to my parents. Je parle à mes parents. And in French, this is called un complément d'objet indirect. Many students were struggling in my classes with the concept of indirect object. So I'm going to explain how to find it in a sentence. First thing first, to make sure that you have an indirect object, you need to ask the right questions. So anytime in French you're asking the questions à qui ou à quoi, you are going to identify the indirect object. I'm going to explain. Same example. Let's say that I'm talking in a very noisy environment. And I would, like now, for instance, you can hear the helicopter of Brooklyn. I would say something like, je parle of, but you're frustrated because you want to know to whom I'm talking to. So the question you would ask would be, à qui parles-tu? À qui est-ce que tu parles? Or tu parles à qui? So even in my questions, I'm using the preposition and I'm using qui or quoi. D'accord? Like to whom or to what, for instance. But for today, for the course of today, I just want to focus on to whom for the use of indirect object pronouns. D'accord? Je parle à mes parents. All right. So once you find out your indirect object in French, you need to use or you can use pronouns. Step one. Let's say I'm saying something like that. Je parle à Paul, which is a sentence that most of my students can make. But if you want to French up your French, you have to use pronouns. And a French person would say, je lui parle. So the thing you can notice in French is that unlike English, we put the pronouns before the verb. That's a big difference with English. So, for instance, in English, you would say, I'm speaking to Paul. Or if you use a pronoun, you would say, I'm speaking to him. But in French, we say something like, I to him speak. So, this is something you need to keep in mind that in French, the pronouns go before the verb. There are exceptions, but for these presentations, I don't want to talk about the exceptions because I think it's important to really understand the general rules. Okay. Another example is je parle à Anna. Anna is a woman. Okay. And the pronoun I'm going to use to say to her, I would say je lui parle. This is a bit strange because lui, you could think that that's masculine. But actually, when it comes to indirect object pronouns, whether you're saying to him or to her, you're going to use lui. Je lui parle. D'accord? And the last example of indirect object pronoun, sorry, is je parle à mes enfants. So I'm speaking to a group of people. D'accord? Je parle à mes enfants. And the pronoun you're going to use is leur. Je leur parle. D'accord? Leur is to them. Je leur parle. Like this. Okay. Um, the things I want to say now is we're back to the three examples that I used in the very first slide. In the very first slides, okay? Je mange une pomme, je parle à mes parents, pardon, et je vais à Paris. The things I want to say to my students also, it's not because you have a preposition like a that you necessarily have an indirect object. For instance, if I say je vais à Paris, the question you would ask to get that piece of information, you're not going to say je vais à qui ou je vais à quoi. No, you're going to say où. Where are you going? Où vas-tu? Ou tu vas où? And où in French, which means where, you're getting an information about a location, about a place, and this cannot be an indirect object. Indirect object is a question of to whom or of what. You have to have a what or a whom in the question you're asking. It cannot be a where when it comes to an indirect object. So this is very, very, very important. You need to go through the entire process to really identify the um, the indirect object pronouns. Okay. And now let's move on to the next part, which is the indirect object pronouns. This slides to me was a revelation. I was like, wow. In English, you do not have indirect object pronouns. You have in English only object pronouns, which would be me, you, him, us, you, them. And when you are in a situation of replacing an indirect object, you're going to use the preposition plus the object pronouns. Okay, so these are the indirect object pronouns you need to know. Lui, most important, or leur, right? So you're going to have that with you. You can take time to review that and practice next time in class. And now I wanted to finish this class with a question I was asked during the workshop is the situation of having multiple pronouns in a sentence, because that can happen. Something like, oh, I'm give it to him, something like this in French. So you might be in a situation of having many pronouns, like maybe a direct object pronouns, an indirect object pronouns, or that pronoun that replaces a location, like e and on, all of these guys. But in French, there's an order that you have to respect. And on this slide, you can visualize it. Okay. This is something that needs practice. And for those of you who are in my advanced intermediate classes, we will definitely work on that next time with exercises because I think it's extremely important. Okay. Um, I have one thing to say to you guys. Courage. No, seriously, the thing I want to say to conclude that presentation is to say that you need to move back and forth with that presentation, a bunch of exercises, maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 exercises. Move back and forth with the exercises, the correction, and understanding your mistake. And the next step is once you feel a little bit more comfortable with the pronouns, is to use them in class, to use them in practice. Practice makes perfection, and that's my motto. And I think it's going to work. And if you have any question, I'm on vacation, but next time in class, I'll be more than happy to respond to any of your questions. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.